Hello again, I'm Dr. Reina Reyes of the National Institute of Physics, and in this lecture, we've been discussing the question, is there life elsewhere in the universe? So we've introduced the Drake equation, which is a way to formulate how to answer this question. And we know that it has these different factors. The first three are astrophysical, and we looked at each of them. And now we will go to the next three, which are biotechnical and more uncertain. And we'll go through each one of them now. So the first factor is F sub L, or the probability that a planet in habitable zone will form life. And this is a very unknown factor because in our planet, we know that as far as we know, life formed exactly once. And we know that all forms of life are connected, came from the same ancestors, and make up and use the same chemical reactions for life. And these are based on these amino acid chains. There are 20 amino acids used by life on Earth. And interestingly, we've found these same amino acids, 15 of them, plus many, many more, in a meteorite. This is called a meteorite fragment. This is called the Murchison meteorite fragment that fell somewhere in Australia back in 1969. And it's an ancient rock that's as old as the formation of the solar system. And it just so happened to fall on Earth, and we're able to study it. And the scientists found more than 75 different amino acids. Not all of them are used by life on Earth. And it makes you wonder if it can be used by life elsewhere, no? By alien forms of life. But the key point here, or fact here, is that these relatively complex compounds, proteins, are actually created naturally with the chemistry that exists in the solar system. And the question still is, what does it take for this complex chemistry to form what we would define to be a living matter versus a non-living matter? And that's still a very open question. Another way to approach this question is to ask how rare this happens, and we can look at our own neighborhood and ask if there's life elsewhere in the solar system. So the most top of mind candidate, as you probably know, is Mars. It's the planet next to us. It's also in the habitable zone. And the question is whether life has persisted below the surface even as the water disappeared. So now we only find traces of liquid water. We know there's a lot of water in solid form in Mars, in ice caps, in the polar regions. The question is whether there ever was life, and if this life can somehow persist. So we've been looking. There have been false alarms for false hopes, but there's always still that possibility. And there are other candidates. Usually cited are these moons in Jupiter and Saturn, where life could exist in an ocean. So in Europa, life could exist in an ocean below the icy surface. Again, we don't know. in the same way, in Enceladus and in Titan, the idea is if you can send a space probe and sample some of these plumes of material, can we detect signs of life or even life forms, microbial life forms themselves. Most recently, and this just happened in September, scientists announced that they detected a biosignature, phosphine, in the atmosphere of Venus. So usually Venus is not top of mind as a candidate for life because it's very, very hot. We mentioned that it's right outside the habitable zone. It's too hot, too close to the sun. Even lead melts in the surface of Venus. But actually in the clouds, in the atmosphere, it has actually a more temperate climate, similar to what's found on Earth, 20 degrees Celsius, but it's highly, highly acidic. So up to 90% acidity that's not found here on Earth. But amazingly, observations have found phosphine, which is a toxic gas that is produced by acidophiles or acid, loving bacteria here on Earth. This is the paper that was published in Nature Astronomy September 14th. And they report the apparent presence of phosphine, or pH3 gas, in Venus's atmosphere, where any phosphorus should be in oxidized forms. That is, from all the known chemistry and chemical reactions that we expect, we are not expecting phosphorus to appear in phosphine, as a phosphine compound. Now, this is an earlier paper from January 2020 that proposed phosphine as a biosignature gas in exoplanet atmospheres. So the idea is to look for this in the spectra of exoplanets. That's what we talked about earlier, the planets orbiting around other stars. And that's actually a sign of potentially anaerobic ecosystems in those exoplanets without oxygen. Essentially, they also looked for this gas in Venus, and they found it. So going back to the Venus paper, these are the observed, this is the observed spectra. And you see here the spectral line. The dip there is the absorption feature that is associated with the phosphine. In particular, a rotational transition that corresponds to this frequency of light, in the submillimeter range, submillimeter to millimeter range, that is observable by these telescopes. So the first finding, the first discovery was from the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope, which is up in the Mauna Kea volcano in Hawaii. It was observed back in June 2017. And when fitting the model of phosphine, you can infer the abundance of phosphine in the atmosphere, and they estimate it to be 20 parts per billion. 20 parts per billion. There's a very small abundance, a very tiny concentration, but it's observable. The instruments are sensitive enough to find it, and also it's large enough to be anomalous. No? Again, it's a question of what is producing this phosphine. And of course, they wanted to confirm, to check whether this is a real signal. And so the team decided to make another observation using a different telescope. It's called the Atacama Large Millimeter Array. It's actually an array of telescopes out in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And this observation was done almost 2 years later in March 2019, and it confirms the signature of phosphine. Again, this is how science works. Now, more scientists and other teams will try to look for this signature and confirm the finding, this finding. And of course, the question is, what is also producing this? And in the conclusion of their paper, they emphasize that the detection of phosphine is not robust evidence for life, only for anomalous and unexplained chemistry. So chemistry can be very complicated, and in a Venusian atmosphere, which we cannot say that we actually know very much in the same way that we know chemistry here on Earth. But as far as we know, the authors looked for different possible sources of phosphine, and they found nothing. So in any case, there should be new science, new explanations for what is producing this phosphine, and life is one candidate. They also mention here that ultimately a solution could come from actually going to Venus and doing in situ measurements. That is actually sending a space probe and collecting samples from the clouds and then analyzing those samples for what could be forms of life. So very exciting times for astrobiology and for, of course, I think in general, and for space exploration. So now we go to the next factor, F sub I, and that is the probability that if a planet develops life, that it will also develop intelligent life. So on Earth, we know that this happened, and this happened, as far as we know, only once. We know that the Earth and the solar system formed 4.6 billion years ago. And at first, there's probably no life, just complex chemistry. And the first evidence for life that we know is from 3.8 billion years ago. So, and 3.8 billion years forward, that evolved to more complex creatures, and eventually we, Homo sapiens, our species, show up just 200,000 years ago. So one way to think about this is by the analogy of the cosmic calendar. So if we think about the Earth calendar that starts January 1, in the beginning of life on Earth, in the beginning of the formation of the Earth. And we look at when our species showed up. It's actually in the final half hour before midnight of the last day of the year, December 31st. So evolution takes time, takes a long time compared to our human lifetimes. But the universe is much older than this. So again, there's plenty of time for life to evolve and for intelligent life to evolve. The question is how hard it is, what's the probability that this happens given the different planets and different environments, different circumstances that exist in the universe. Of course, again, this is a very hard question even to define, because we cannot even really define what intelligence is. So we say we know it when we see it, we know we are intelligent creatures, but we also find intelligent animal behaviors. So from our closest relatives, the apes and chimpanzees, they use tools. We see it in some kinds of birds. They can solve problems, like put here rocks in in the tubes to make the water level rise. And of course, dolphins actually even have a complicated language or a way to communicate with one another. Um, and they have their own kinds of ways of perceiving and interpreting and um, making their way in their own environments. Um, how 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 um, how different can intelligence look like if we imagine alien, even alien forms of life. So it's again a very big question mark and very fascinating question to ponder and speculate. Finally, we have the third factor in our biotechnical set of factors, F sub T, which stands for technology. In our case, we're able to broadcast signals, radio signals out since the invention of um, since their invention 100 years ago. So again, just a flick of a second, and that means that there's a sphere around the Earth, 200 light years in diameter, and all the stars in that region would have had the chance to listen and receive our signals. Of course, as illustrated here, that's a very small region compared to the size of the galaxy. The galaxy itself is 100,000 light years across. So you see here the difficulty of communication between different civilizations. It's really because of the vastness of the distances that and the finite speed of light. Um, so that it will take a lot of time for light to reach the farther parts of the galaxy, uh, even hundreds of thousands of years. Um, that is much longer than um, the 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 lifetime of a single human or even generations and the generations of technology that we've had so far. But what this means is we're actually a civilization that's capable of communicating. And the question is whether there are others out there who can receive our signal or can in turn communicate with us. And SETI, which we've been mentioning throughout this lecture, is active and is actually has time on the Allen Telescope Array in California to listen for these signals from the nearby stars. So in the next and final part of this lecture, we will bring all of this together and look at potential implications for our own civilization here on Earth.